Hey everyone. Let me get this in my jean jacket pocket. I'm wearing a jean jacket. It's gonna make me feel earthy, feel proletarian. This is the stuff at the beginning and the introduction to Marx Worldwide on the development of the international discourse on Marx since 1965 by Jan Hoff, translated by Nicholas Gay. This book is with the Historical Materialism book series, originally in German. I've read this book before myself on my own a long time ago. I think maybe before I started recording myself reading things. And it's really tremendous. It's really a tremendous book. Its scope and depth is really impressive. I really like this book. This is one of those books where I'd say, like, if I was to talk to somebody about Marx, I'd be like, read this, because it's kind of like gives you a large overview of a lot of different thinkers, from Louis Althusser to Hans-Georg Backhaus to Enrique Dussel, all those good people, Apparismo people, Mario Tronti, for instance. And you should probably read this before you start. It's probably more worth your time. You'll get more bang for your buck, so to speak, if you read a book like this, as opposed to going straight to the primary sources right away, or the secondary sources. This is a secondary source about secondary sources, and it's tremendous. I think there's a lot. I think books like this are extremely valuable. Another book that's kind of like this, on a different topic, of course, is Marcel van der Linden's Western Marxism of the Soviet Union, which I think is just like, if I was a scholar, and I wrote a book like either Jan Hoff's book here or Marcel van der Linden's Western Marxism of the Soviet Union, like these big, grandiose intellectual histories that kind of cover so much ground and provide like a really necessary overview of all the kind of positions you have to consider when forming your own position on any of these questions. I find these. I'd be very proud to have my name behind a title like this. So congratulations, Jan Hoff, on this book, even though you wrote it, I don't know, probably 15 years ago or more now. Yeah, it was published in paperback by Haymarket in 2017. So yeah, it was published in English 10 years ago. So it was probably published, probably in the 2000s in Germany. Anyway, enough of my yakking. Here's the table of contents. Section 1 of the book is titled The Development of Varying Marx-Oriented Conceptual Approaches Between the Poles of Politics and Theory from the 1960s to the Present. Section 1 is titled Dogmatic Marxism Before the Political and Theoretical Upheaval, with the headings Soviet Marxism-Leninism Before De-Stalinisation. The second heading is titled A Brief Insight into the Current State of Research into Chinese Marxism Before 1978. Section 2 is titled Marxism's Resurgence Between the Inception and Highpoint of Political Movements of Emancipation, circa 1960/1965 to 1977, with the headings Western Europe and the Anglo-Saxon World, Latin America and Asia, quote, Heretical Marxism in Eastern Europe. Section 3 is titled From the Proclamation of the, quote, Crisis of Marxism, and quote, to the Decline of Marxism as a Mass Ideology, circa 1974 to 1990, with the headings Europe and North America and Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Section 4 is titled The Global Situation After the End of Marxism as a Mass Ideology. Chapter 2 is titled The Further Development of the Marx Debate Since the 1960s, a Survey, with Section 1, West Germany. Section 2, Japan, with the headings The Situation Before 1945 and The Evolution of the Japanese Debate from the Post-War Period to the Present. I have some pieces from I guess I shouldn't say that because I can say that for a lot of the things in here. I have pieces from the people involved in a lot of these. So I have some. I don't know if I have any Kozo Uno himself, but I definitely have Thomas Sakine and Robert Albritton and God, what's the other guy's name? John R. Bell on this channel, who are like part of like the Uno school. I have a piece that's I got actually from this book, like a secondary source, about Samizo Kuruma, an important Japanese Marxist in this period. Anyway, section 3 is titled Other Asian Countries, with the headings South Asia and East Asia. Section 4 is titled The Former Socialist Countries in Europe. The headings the Soviet Union, the GDR, and other former socialist countries in Europe. Section 5 is titled Italy, France, and other West European countries, with the headings Italy, France, and other Western European countries. Section 6 is titled Latin America and Spain, with the headings Latin America and Spain. I'd really like, there's a really important book, what's his name? Maybe it's probably in the table of contents here, but a guy named, I think it's Stefan Gandler, wrote a book about critical Marxism in Mexico, which I think would be, about Adolfo Sanchez Vasquez and Bolivar Echeverria, which is, I'd really like to read that. Section 7, the Anglo-Saxon world, the headings Critical Excursus on Perry Anderson's book In the Tracks of Historical Materialism. Part 3 of the book, or chapter 3 of the book, is titled In-Depth Analyses, Central Discourses Within the German and International Discussions of Marx from the 1980s to the present, with section 1 being The Understanding of the Object of Critique and Value Theory, with the headings On the Understanding of the Object of the Critique of Political Economy. At heading 2, A Survey of the International Debate on Marxist Theory of Value, with a particular focus on the analysis of the value form and summary. Section 2 is titled The Problematic of Inquiry and Exposition in the Critique of Political Economy, with the headings heading 1, a quote, Mont Blanc of research material. Heading 2, the ascent from the abstract to the concrete and the quote, problem of the beginning, end quote, in Marx's presentation. Heading 3, the relation of Marx's critique of political economy to Hegel's philosophy as reflected in the international debate. Section 3 is titled The 6-Volume Plan and the Concept of, quote, Capital in General, with the headings The Structure of the Critique of Political Economy in 6 volumes, The Problematic of, quote, Capital in General. Section 4 is titled Crisis Theory in and After Marx, with the headings Approaches to the Interpretation of Marx's Crisis Theory, An Insight into the Marx-Oriented Discussion of Crisis in South Korea following the Asian Financial Crisis of 1997, Excursus on the World Market in Crisis. Okay, so that's the table of contents. Here's the preface. The present study is a revised version of my doctoral thesis, which bore the title Globalization of the Critique of Political Economy on the Development of the International Discourse on Marx from the 1960s to the present. Footnote, thanks are due to Frank Engster, as the pieces by Frank Engster on this channel, William Lewis, Gary Roth. I think Gary Roth, I'm not sure. I think he wrote the biography on, it might be someone else that I'm thinking of. But I think Gary Roth wrote a biography of Paul Maddox Sr., Christoph Lieber, Nate Hawthorne, Riccardo Bellafiore, Tommaso Rodolfi Riva, Simon Mussel, and others for bibliographical assistance provided during the preparation of the English language edition of this book. And footnote. As a comprehensive worldview, Marxism is historically obsolete. Yet Marx's theoretical approach, which consists in a detailed exposition of the internal interconnection of economic categories and relations, and effects a, quote, disenchantment, end quote, of the, quote, inverted world, end quote, of the economy is still of great theoretical significance. Marx's goal of theoretical inquiry into and exposition of the economic laws of motion of modern bourgeois society has lost none of its relevance. Internationally, over the last 50 years in particular, generations of researchers have engaged with Marx's insights. The object of the present study, which is composed of 3 central chapters, is to outline the historical development within this international discourse. In Chapter 1, an exposition is undertaken of the development of Marx-oriented conceptual approaches between the poles of politics and history. Chapter 2 deals with the further development of the reception of Marx and of Marx-oriented critical social theory, providing a survey of the historical development of the discussion in various regions of the world, especially since circa 1965. Finally, Chapter 3 engages in more depth with central discourses within the German language and international scientific discussion of Marx from the 1980s to the present. The above doctoral thesis was accepted by the Department of History and Cultural Studies at the Free University of Berlin in the summer semester of 2008. It was successfully defended on the 22nd of December 2008. My special thanks go to my primary supervisors, Dr. Wolfgang Wippermann. I think Wolfgang Wippermann wrote a book on Marx. I think he's written books on anti-Semitism as well. I'm not sure. I think he's more of like a historian. No, but he definitely wrote a book on Marx that I think is important. I think is respected. Dr. Frieder Otto Wolff. I have a piece or 2 by him on this channel, both of whom consistently support and accompany my doctoral research project. I would also like to thank the participants of the research colloquia for both professors for their fruitful contributions to the discussion. In addition, I would like to express my gratitude to Mishka Damashka for his commitment to my work in his role as publishing editor of Akademie Verlag. Dr. Michael Heinrich, Professor Dr. Rolf Hecker. I have a piece by Rolf Hecker. I think he's important in the Mega. Dr. Thomas Sakine, important in popularizer and a theoretician in his own right of the work of Kozo Uno. Dr. Jose Maria Duran, Martin Berkner, Rafael Carrion, Ken Kubota deserve my thanks for the valuable support they provided. I think Ken Kubota is interested in left history in Japan, but I'm not sure. That might be making that up. Last but not least, I'm grateful to the Berliner Verein für Förderung der Mega Edition E5 for a financial grant towards the publication of this book. Jan Hoff, Berlin, April 2009. So here we are, introduction. In the first volume of Capital, Marx located the, quote, homeland of political economy, end quote, in, quote, Western Europe. He likewise ascribed a relatively limited geographical space to his own theory, i.e. the critique of political economy. At least he did so in his letter to Ferdinand Lassalle of the 12th of November 1958, in which he referred to his theoretical project of the critique of political economy as a contribution to science, quote, in the German sense, end quote. Quote, in your letter from Frankfurt, you said nothing about your economic work. As far as our rivalry is concerned, I don't believe that the German public suffers from the embarras de richesse in this field. In fact, economics as a science in the German sense of the word has yet to be tackled, and to that end, not just the 2 of us, but a dozen will be needed, end quote. Marx. Footnote. It is an open question as to what Marx actually meant by his statement that the study of, quote, economics as a science in the German sense, end quote, was yet to be undertaken. It is possible that he was making an implicit reference to Hegel, or perhaps to the underdeveloped state of contemporary German economics in comparison to British economics. What is clear in any case is that Marx situated his theoretical project within a specific national context. End footnote. Likewise, in his famous review of Marx's contribution to the critique of political economy of 1859, Engels wrote the following, quote, well, in this way in Germany, the bourgeoisie, the schoolmasters, and the bureaucrats were still making great exertions to learn by rote, and in some measure to understand, the first elements of Anglo-French political economy, which they regarded as incontestable dogmas. The German proletarian party appeared on the scene. Its theoretical aspect was wholly based on a study of political economy. And German political economy Listen, independent science dates also from the emergence of this party. The essential foundation of this German political economy is the materialist conception of history, whose principal features are briefly outlined in the preface to the above-named work. End quote. And that work he's referring to is a contribution to the critique of political economy. And if you don't know, when I repeat something, that means it's in italics. Marx considered the critique of political economy to be a contribution to economic science, quote, in the German sense, end quote. Engels regarded it as German political economy. Thus, both thinkers explicitly added a national epithet to the critique of political economy. Nonetheless, Marx's critique of political economy was received, discussed, and further developed beyond national, linguistic, and continental boundaries. This process has occurred in a more intensive form in the period spanning from the 1960s to the present than at any previous time. Accordingly, a kind of globalization in the sphere of theory and science can be said to have taken place. Footnote: Marx's allusion to, quote, science in the, quote, German sense should be borne in mind in the context of the present work. Quote, science and, quote, scientific should be taken as referring to the dialectical theory as exhibited in Marx's critique of political economy with its debt to Hegelian dialectic as acknowledged by Marx, in contrast to what might justifiably be characterized as the Anglo-American positivist understanding of science, which holds sway within the, quote, scientific community, end quote, today. End footnote. Accordingly, a kind of globalization in the sphere of theory and science can be said to have taken place. It is important to note here that the focus of the present study is explicitly placed on the history of the international interpretation and discussion of Marx's, quote, mature critique of political economy, rather than on the international publishing history of Marx's works. More precisely, the object of the present work is the international reception of the critique of political economy in the period from the 1960s to the present. And I think this is important. This is an important thing to say. Is like this book isn't like an exhaustive thing about like Marxism, quite like as such. At least that's how I remember the book. It's specifically about Marx's mature critique of the capitalist mode of production, right? So the critique of political economy, and not other things within Marx that are like also important, like the more philosophical discussions about some key texts, like obviously the place of like the 1844 manuscript, or also like the German ideology, and how like and just the other important topics within Marxism, the relation between the more evolutionary, positivistic Second International kind of Marxism and Western Marxism, and all those kinds of things. Like there's a lot of work on Marx that kind of in like the post-war period, and that's why this book probably starts at probably a reason why this book starts in 1965, is that there was a lot of work being done on Marx in the 1960s, but a lot of it didn't particularly pertain to the critique of political economy. There was a lot of deciphering the meaning of like the 1844 manuscripts and whether Marxism was a science and all those kinds of things, the relationship between new intellectual development, psychoanalysis and Marxism, existentialism and Marxism, phenomenology and Marxism. All these kinds of things were like important topics, and people were writing on them. But the critique, this book is specifically about the writings on like Grundrisse, Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, 3 volumes of Capital, Theories of Surplus Value, or whatever we want to call the 1863 manuscripts, which is what Theories of Surplus Value, to my memory, is made of. It's 1861 to 1863. I don't know, but that's the book. I think that's the manuscript. So those are what Theories of Surplus Value comes from, and then 1863 to 1865, which is where the Theories for Capital Volume 3 come from. So this book is about like those kinds of works, as opposed to my memory at least, those kinds of works, rather than say like works about like, for instance, like Marx's theory of alienation, or any of those kinds of things. Anyway, nonetheless, Marx's critique of political... Where the hell am I? The globalization of Marxian theory was already underway in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Various studies of this period of this early process of dissemination have been published in the intervening period. Footnote, see for example, Oroeva, 1978. End footnote. By the time of the October Revolution, and perhaps earlier, this phenomenon also encompassed the countries of the, quote, global south and east, and, quote, in a consolidated way. However, Marx's doctrine was frequently propagated in a form heavily inflected by the Marxisms of the Second and Third Internationals. The 1960s and 1970s represent a watershed in the history of the globalization of Marxian theory for reasons which are both political and immanent within the theory itself. Firstly, the new, quote, wave of globalization, end quote, which was generated in this time, came after the De-Stalinisation of the Soviet Union, and it was at the forefront, or at least occurred within the context, of the formation of new emancipatory social revolutionary movements on a worldwide scale. Secondly, the new era of globalization of Marxian theory, which began in the 1960s, was accompanied by the emergence and development of an innovative and as such novel theoretical potential in the interpretation and further elaboration of the Marxian critique of political economy. This process developed and continued to develop in several areas of the world almost simultaneously, occasionally with a high degree of interdependence between the various local processes, with the result that a complex web of mutual theoretical references, international transfer of theory, and intellectual exchanges now stretches across the globe. In the last 2 decades, an enormous transformation took place which generated the conditions of a genuine globalization of Marxian theory and the related discussion. After the fall of the, quote, Iron Curtain in 1989/90, the opportunities for a lively and open exchange of ideas between researchers from East and West were much improved. The second Marx-Engels-Gesamtausgabe, or Mega 2, formerly under the aegis of party-affiliated institutes in East Berlin and Moscow, has been continued as a publishing project with an increased international orientation since the 1990s, with cooperation between researchers in the, quote, West, quote, East, and, quote, Far East. With its highly rigorous editorial principles, Mega 2 not only affords access to previously virtually unknown sources in relation to Marx's critique of political economy, among other things, thus providing new material for source-oriented research, but also connects the scientific work of numerous historians, social and political scientists, economists, and philologists in different countries and continents. Likewise, since the 1990s, the Internet has enabled the rapid worldwide dissemination of the results of research and facilitated communication between researchers. The present work is a study in the history of theory and examines several aspects of the broad and variegated field of international processes of theory formation in connection with the Marxian critique of political economy within the period from circa 1965 to the present, with the focus on the period since 1965 and the simultaneous emphasis on the specifically international and intercontinental dimensions of the process of theoretical development in relation to the critique of political economy. This work fills a gap in research despite the multiplicity of existing approaches to the historiography of Marxism. Some 2 decades after the collapse of, quote, actually existing socialism, end quote, the question which might be asked of a study of the development of certain theoretical currents which have taken up, interpreted, or further developed Marx's critique of political economy on a worldwide scale over the last 50 years is the following. How is such a study of contemporary relevance? It is so in at least two regards. Firstly, the case of many of the currents thematized in my inquiry, these represent forms of thought which draw on Marx, but which cannot be placed under the rubric of an anachronistic, quote, science of legitimation, end quote, in the context of an authoritarian party dictatorship. On the contrary, these currents were mainly forms of, quote, dissident Marxism, often emerging in opposition to the orthodox Marxist-Leninism of the communist parties, from which they dissociated themselves. Secondly, the historic failure of, quote, actually existing socialism, end quote, in no way negated the most important aspects of the Marxian critique of political economy, since the object of this critique was not socialism but capitalism. Thus, an exposition such as the present one, situating itself within the history of theory and exploring the various readings and currents of interpretation of Marx's project of a critical theory of capitalism that have developed over recent decades, is of undiminished contemporary significance and relevance. In the following, Marx's critique of political economy is to be grasped as a critical theory oriented to the investigation of the structure and laws of motion of the modern capitalist economy. Marx's critique of political economy can also be described as a, quote, critical theory of capitalist society, end quote. Thus, if the present study undertakes the exploration of the history of the globalization of Marxian theory, or of Marxism more broadly, as a critical social theory from the 1960s to the present, It does so by significantly restricting the relevant thematic field within the history of the formation of Marxist theory in the sense outlined above. The historical development of dialectical materialism, of historical materialism, and of the various approaches to concrete Marxist historiography and to Marxist political theory, in a narrow sense, do not fall within the scope of this work and are not considered here. The dissociation of Marxism as a critical theory from these fields of Marxist theory formation is itself the result of a process of historical development. Other elements which have long molded the understanding of Marxism, for example, as a, quote, dialectics of nature, and, quote, drawing on the late Engels, or as a specific deterministic conception of history through a construal of the work of both Marx and Engels, withdrew into the background within the historical process of the development of theory, or were increasingly regarded critically, at the same time as there was a growing interest in Marxism as a critical social theory, at least in some areas within the international reception of Marx. A more precise explanation of how Marxism can be characterized as a, quote, critical social theory, end quote, cannot be given in advance, however. Rather, this will emerge from the exposition of the historical process within the development of Marx-related theory. In apparent opposition to the virtually global dimension in which the formation of Marx-oriented theory has occurred, a theoretical provincialism has remained a regrettable characteristic, and something of a tradition within the history of thought inspired by Marx and within that of the reception of his theory. This is the case not least with regard to the German language discussion of Marx. It is precisely due to this theoretical provincialism, and in view of the corresponding vacuum in research and knowledge in German-speaking countries, that the task of analyzing the historical development of theory on an international scale since the 1960s is of such significance, particularly in these countries themselves. Footnote. Nevertheless, the problematic of the relation between Marx and or Marxism and interculturality has been the subject of a discussion within the discipline of philosophy in recent times in Germany. Marco Iorio has arrived at the ambivalent conclusion that the, quote, anti-interculturalist traits which can be unequivocally demonstrated in Marx and his work, and, quote, contrast, quote, with a whole series of characteristics which definitely indicate the presence of some interculturalist trace elements, end quote. Marco Iorio, end footnote. In the introduction to his comprehensive study of the Latin American thinkers, Adolfo Sanchez Vasquez and Bolivar Echeverria, both of whom take up Marx's work, Stefan Gondler writes, exaggerating somewhat, but identifying a real problem, as follows, quote, while, for example, in Mexico every theoretical, quote, innovation, in Europe or the United States is followed and commented upon with care, not only are translations prepared, but they are also published and read. In Frankfurt, the simple discovery that two philosophers living in Mexico are worth reading arouses exclamations of delight or commotion, both expressions of the same phlegmatic self-satisfaction, end quote. Stefan Gondler. In actual fact, the problem is not merely that there is only a very limited German body of knowledge on, for example, the Latin American theoretical discussion. This in itself is a deficit which ought to be eradicated or at least reduced, weighing even more heavily are the lack of openness to and disinterest in the Latin American debate and its history. Gondler's reference to, quote, exclamations of delight, end quote, might be expanded upon by adding that a euphoric, uncritical reception of the history of processes of theory formation in the, quote, global South and East, end quote, would be no more constructive than the currently prevailing indifference. This would merely be the other side of the coin of theoretical provincialism. An example of theoretical provincialism, again, within the context of the German discussion, is to be found in Christoph Henning's important monograph on the development of Marx-related philosophical thought after Marx. Henning justifies the predominant focus on literature in the German language with the argument that an approach specifically oriented to philosophy is bound to refer especially to the discussion in the German language. This, he contends, is because the three sources of Marxism identified by Lenin in his famous thesis of 1913, French socialism, English political economy, and German philosophy, have since drifted in different directions. Already for Lenin, the third, quote, source of Marxism, end quote, was not simply philosophy, but German philosophy. Quote, Germans, a metaphysical people, have their problems with politics, and thus Marx was soon read in, quote, an intellectual, unquote, way. Once again, he was re-philosophized, end quote. Henning. Henning's argument in relation to his particular concentration on the German language philosophical discussion is questionable. A decidedly philosophical approach to the critique of political economy is not specifically and certainly not exclusively a characteristic of the German or German language debate. Thinkers such as the Latin American Enrique Dussel, the Briton Christopher Arthur, or the Russian Viktor Vazulin immediately spring to mind as counterexamples in this regard. All three figure later in the study. In the case of Dussel, it can be stated in advance that his original approach to Marx's work is taken precisely from the, quote, peripheral, Latin American and decidedly non-Eurocentric perspective of the philosophy of liberation, i.e. simultaneously from a specifically philosophical and specifically Latin American standpoint. An exemplary case of provincialism in Germany, and especially in the western part of the country, is provided by the preface to the commemorative volume for Helmut Reichheld, written by some of his students and their associates. The historical development of the interpretive orientation labeled by Hans-Georg Backhaus as the, quote, Neue Marx-Lektura, or New Marx Reading, which focuses in a specific way on Marx's understanding of object and method, is traced by these authors aptly enough on some points. Yet at a secondary glance, at the latest, it is striking that they not only concentrate on Germany, worse still, their scope is limited to the former Federal Republic of Germany, and in fact they identify one unambiguous central locus, Frankfurt am Main. This claim is not tenable with regard to the facts of the matter, i.e. with regard to the historical development of the Neue Marx-Lektura as a reception of Marx. In the course of the present study, it will become evident that it is thoroughly appropriate to understand important theorists, quote, from all over the world, and quote, precisely as the protagonists of a new Marx reading, and indeed in the sense that their approaches to the interpretation of Marx are in decisive aspects extremely similar to those of the West German discursive constellation around Hans-Georg Backhaus, Helmut Brentel, Michael Heinrich, etc. Just as a side note, I think a major example of this, that in my view, is the work of who I said earlier, Samizo Kuruma, who definitely put a lot of emphasis on like the necessarily. I think one of the things that's important for the Marx Lectura and for part of the broader scope of people who we call value form theorists, their main thing with the value form is understanding that value, and this is why fetishism is so important for this discussion, is that value value has its necessary form of appearance in money. And so, like, value must be, in a certain sense, caught, right? There's the necessity of value being expressed in exchange value. And that's something that you find very much on display in Samizo Kuruma, who I have read personally. I'm sure what Hoff is saying here applies to a large array of figures, but in this particular case, I know this to be the case. I know this to be true. That there is a very much a serious overlap between these figures, and I don't think and also obviously there's such a big overlap, for instance, between Isaac Illich Rubin, right, and who's kind of like an important person in the value form analysis. And I think obviously these figures are also in this kind of like milieu of like Frankfurt School influence critical theory, which, Adorno, for instance, putting such an emphasis on exchange, and then the same with Alfred Sohn Rettel. What was I going to say? I don't know why that brought them up, but maybe I was just flexing. Yeah. I think that's one of the main theses of this book, is try to kind of, I think, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm misremembering this. So one of the core things of this book is that kind of like, in a certain sense, Ricardian interpretations of Marxism are like theoretically obsolete and have been kind of, maybe I'm wrong about that, but this is my memory of it, like Ricardian theories of Marxism that kind of view value in some sense, and thus labor in the abstract labor as like transhistorical features of just like production of things in general. They very much that whole kind of like more like naturalistic, or what Michael Heinrich calls substantialist reading of Marx's value theory is not only like, you might have like, there's like a general push back against this, and it's theoretically successful. That's my memory of it. And I think, like, obviously, like, I think Jan Hoff is very much in that kind of like world of like. I think he's probably very similar to Hans-Georg Backhaus and Helmut Brentel and Heinrich. That's my understanding, at least, or that's my memory of this. Yeah. I think that seems like a big part of it, is like just emphasizing the global reach of this critique of like substantialist understandings of value theory. That's my memory, at least. I don't know. Maybe I'm off base. The present work aims to overcome theoretical provincialism. The task here is to provide an exposition of the international historical development of a specific current of Marx-related thought over the last 5 decades. Nevertheless, such an understanding requires critical self-reflection on the part of its author regarding his or her own criteria, evaluations, and level of expertise. The present study is a, quote, international history of the reception, end quote, of Marx's critique of political economy. It should be noted, however, that it is written from a specific West German perspective. It is permeated by the author's point of view, which has been arrived at through the West German Neue Marx-Lektüre. Okay, so I am right. Moreover, my familiarity with non-German language debates, and particularly those in Asian or Slavic languages, which are inaccessible to me, is necessarily limited. A number of attempts, some of them very elaborate, at a historicization of Marxism have been published, in which the specifically international character of the processes of the formation of Marxist theory is taken into account. At the same time, it can be demonstrated that there is room for improvement with regard to the treatment, by some of the historians of Marxism referred to here, of the specifically global dimension of the reception of Marxist theory and of processes of the formation of Marx-related theory. An important work on the history of Marxism as a theory is that of the Yugoslav philosopher Predrag Vranički, and I believe I have pieces by him on this channel. And obviously, Gerson Scher wrote one of the big books. I think there's a couple. There's more than one. But he wrote one of the big books in the 1970s on the history of the practice school, which is on this channel. I also have one, if you're interested, about more just like kind of like humanistic readings of Marx in general, coming from the Eastern Bloc, so like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and so on, in addition to Yugoslavia, obviously, which was independent of those countries, was not part of like the Soviet-aligned Eastern Bloc, although it was a communist country. But check out those pieces. The first edition of The History of Marxism, published in 1961, contains the development up to the end of the 1950s, while the second edition from 1971 takes into account the progression up to 1968. The author was involved with the Praxis group, and as such can be considered a representative of a specifically Yugoslav Marxism, which is independent of the Soviet orthodoxy. Vranički was close to the current of humanist Marxism. The first part of Vranički's comprehensive work deals with Marx and Engels themselves. The second part covers the Marxism of the period of the First and Second Internationals. The third part is dedicated to Lenin. The fourth part treats the Marxism of the period of the Third International. The fifth and final part, which is of most interest here, engages with the Marxism of the contemporary period. Under this heading, the Yugoslav philosopher includes, firstly, Marxism in the quote, socialist camp. Secondly, Chinese Marxism. Thirdly, Marxism in the capitalist world, especially in West Germany, France, Italy, and the Anglo-Saxon countries. And finally, Marxism in his own country. Vranički's wide-ranging study in the history of theory is indispensable as a significant standard work in the historiography of Marxism. Yet in his concluding observations, Vranički makes the following remarks on Marxist thought. Quote, "It emerged and developed as the expression of European culture, and it is on European soil that it has achieved its greatest and most fruitful victories. The other centers of modern civilization did not represent suitable terrains for the further development of such complex thinking. Whether this was due to their historically backward situation, or to their lack of certain cultural and intellectual traditions, the other parts of the world were only able thus far to contribute to this development in the periods of the most intense practical revolutionary action, and indeed especially with regard to the socio-political problematic and to revolutionary praxis." End quote. Vranički. On the basis of the results of research, represented in this study, it can be demonstrated not only that Wernicke's judgment is inappropriate in view of the contemporary situation in the early 21st century, but also that the Eurocentric verdict of the Yugoslav historian of Marxism is also problematic in the period up to 1968, as dealt with in the second edition of his work. I want to be cautious here because I think that Jan Hoff is right, but there is like a delayed. One of the things is like that there is a delayed history of the dissemination of Marx's works, right? So things that are very, very important, say like the Grundrisse or even the 1844 manuscripts, took a while for it to develop in like other Europe, to be disseminated in other European countries in their languages, right? In the 1950s, there was a lot of work in like France, for instance, of Maximilien Rubel, like bringing Marx translations into like a collected works independently of Moscow and the Communist Party. So there is like a degree of like staggered translation, and therefore I think there is a degree of like staggered reception with Marx's work, and like I think it makes sense. I think that like it seems to me at least that a lot of Marxism was kind of oriented towards was kind of like politically focused, especially. I mean, maybe I'm wrong about that, but it seems like what was important was less like the nuances of Marx's Capital and more on like the Communist Manifesto and like more, and also since a large part of like the dispersion of Marxism worldwide, I would say the most important thing for it seems to me, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to me the most important thing for the dispersion of Marxism on like a global scale was the revolution, the October Revolution of 1917. That seems to me like absolutely crucial, with the founding of like the Third International and the development of national communist parties. Obviously, Marx had an existence before that. He died in 1883, and people were there was Marxists, before the 1917 revolution. Obviously, the people who did the October Revolution obviously were Marxist of some variety. So obviously Marxists exist, but I think that was a very, very important thing in the spread of Marxism throughout the globe. Was the presence and existence of the Soviet Union. I think that I think I've gotten off the rails here about what I originally wanted to say, but it does seem like there's a very much extent to which like theory was somewhat delayed, and I think it was even somewhat delayed in Germany itself, right? The Mega wasn't something, it's still an ongoing project now, the Mega 2, but even I think a lot of text in just the Marxist history weren't very accessible, right? I think the 1844 manuscripts, for instance, they were like a revelation in Germany too. I mean, I know he's talking specifically about the critique of political economy here, but there does seem to be like a differentiation in the global spread of Marxism. And especially like a lot of people being under the influence of like Maoism. I think, to my understanding at least, I mean, I'm not a super expert, but I think especially on like the critique of political economy, but I'm not even sure. I'm talking on my ass a little bit, like Chinese Marxism was kind of, I think a lot of people think it's pretty theoretically impoverished. I think that's even like the position of someone like Maurice Meisner, who's kind of got a sort of sympathetic feeling toward Mao, even if also extremely critical one, not just an apologist or something like that, but like people, I don't know, sorry, I'm just rambling on here. Basically what I'm saying is there is a degree to which things get to other places later, and I don't know necessarily what the significance of that is as such, but I don't think it's just I don't know. Seems perhaps what's being implied here, there's some kind of Eurocentric racism going on, and I don't know if that's particularly fair. maybe that's not what's being said, and maybe I'm putting words into people's mouths here, but it seems to me that it is very much the case that just as globalization in the economic and technological sense, and the industrial development of various places has taken place in this time, I think there's a corresponding something that you could say correspondingly about the distribution of theoretical ideas, especially when those ideas like are initiated in Europe and their dissemination worldwide. And that's true of just like philosophies in general, right? For instance, like the never mind. The exiled Polish non-Marxist philosopher and historian of ideas Leszek Kolakowski authored a further important work on the history of Marxism. This work was conceived by him as a handbook. Leszek Kolakowski was a Marxist at a time. I think he became more of just like a liberal after that, and probably anti-Marxist too. He wrote the big book, like the fucking huge volume, like the main currents of Marxism, which is what's being referred to. And I think he wrote this when he was no longer a Marxist, so it is correct, but he was a Marxist. So it should say probably former Marxist as opposed to non-Marxist, but that's just... I started talking and now I can't shut up. The first volume principally covers Marx and Engels and locates them within the history of theory. The second volume deals with the period spanning from the Marxism of the Second International to Leninism. Finally, the third volume encompasses the development from early Soviet Marxism to the Marxism-Leninism of the post-war period. It also deals with the Marxisms of Gramsci, Lukács, Korsch, Lucien Goldman, and the leading exponents of the Frankfurt School, Marcuse, Bloch. Lastly, it provides an overview of the most recent developments in Marxism at the time it was composed. The final volume, which covers up the period, which is the focus of the present study, dates from 1975 to 76. Like Wernicke's study, Kolakowski's comprehensive standard work is characterized by Eurocentrism. The names of such significant Latin American or Asian theorists as Adolfo Sanchez Vasquez, Marta Harnacker, Hijame Kawakami, Kozo Uno, and Samizo Kuruma do not figure in the index of names in Kolakowski's compendium. Is Marta Harnacker? Is she? I think it's a she. They are a she. I think they might be married to that guy, Michael Leibowitz, who wrote like the what's it? Political economy of the working class, or what's it? Something like that. About from the 90s. It was an important book. I can't remember what it's called. It's probably in here. What the hell is the book I'm looking for? I have to look it up. I'll see if it's in here. Leibowitz. Yeah, Beyond Capital, Marx's Political Economy of the Working Class. I think that might be her partner or something. I'm not sure. However, Kolakowski himself states the following at the beginning of the third volume. Quote, "The present volume deals with the evolution of Marxism in the last half-century. Writing it has involved special difficulties, one of which is the sheer bulk of the available literature. No historian can be fully acquainted with it, and it is therefore, so to speak, impossible to do everyone justice." End quote. Along with the historian E.P. Thompson, one of the most important protagonists of the intellectual New Left of the 1960s and 1970s in the UK was Perry Anderson.
You gonna be ready to go soon?
Yeah, I'm ready now.
Okay, Matthew, I remember when we were there at his birthday, I don't even know where you were, but he sat at the kitchen table and ate almost that whole jar of pears in one sitting.
That's good.
But,
I'm ready. I'm recording a thing. Can I talk to you in a little while? Thank you. I appreciate your compassion for my stupid activities. Anderson's attempt at a historicization of a determinate domain of Marxist thought. Sorry, where was I? Alongside the historian E.P. Thompson, one of the most important protagonists of the intellectual New Left of the 1960s and 1970s in the UK was Perry Anderson, not merely on account of the latter's editorial activity for New Left Review, formerly a significant journal in the area of Marxist theory. Anderson's attempt at a historicization of the determinate domain of Marxist thought in the 20th century, which he published in his book Considerations on Western Marxism in 1976, had a relatively large impact, reaching beyond the borders of the Anglo-Saxon world. Yeah, I think Perry Anderson, just as a side note, I talk about this all the time, but Perry Anderson, and I think like other people from like the New Left Review, like Thierry Galli, are very pretty, to my understanding, a pretty conventional understanding of Marxism, in the sense, if you mean by conventional, like the Third International-y kind of Marxism. They're Trotskyists, but I would say that they're on the more conservative end of Trotskyism, right? So they're not like Tony Cliffites, and they're most certainly not like people like Vrya Dunayevskaya or C.L.R. James. Like, they do not accept like that the USSR was a class society. They held on to the degenerated worker state, or in its more like watered down form, like the transitional society of that was a kind of common with like in like a post-Trotskyism in like the after World War II. So their influences are kind of like the more conservative end of Trotskyism, with those influences being like Ernest Mandel, very important Trotskyist theoretician and Marxist economist in general, Marxist theorist in general, but also even, I would say, it seems to me even more so, was the independent scholar Isaac Deutscher, who definitely was, I would say, was even almost in certain respects barely a Trotskyist, insofar as he was like almost like a reform communist, right? He kind of was like a supporter of the Eastern Bloc, thought that the Eastern Bloc was on some brink of some kind of like top-down reform, initiated within like a more liberal-minded or a less authoritarian or hardline segment of the bureaucracy of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And so I don't even think if you accept that, if you think that Trotsky, one of the parts of like Trotskyism and what it meant in the 20th century was the view of like the necessity of a political revolution within the USSR in order to overthrow the Stalinist bureaucracy. Now, thank you, Mother. One sign of this impact, among others, where the hell am I? Yeah, but so yeah, that's like, they're kind of like, so it would make sense if they were kind of like hostile in some sense to, at least in some sense, to like Western Marxism, even though the press that came out of New Left Review, New Left books, which became Verso, probably the biggest left-wing publisher, I would say, in the United States, and probably in the English-speaking world in general, obviously released a lot of the books of Western Marxism, people from the Frankfurt School and so forth. It makes sense that they were hostile to it, to like some of like the theoretical work that's done within the world of Western Marxism, due to its kind of more critical attitude to traditional like diamat or things of that sort. I don't know, maybe I'm talking about my ass here. Anderson's attempt at a historicization of a determinate domain of Marxist thought in the 20th century, which he published in his book Considerations on Western Marxism in 1976, had a relatively large impact reaching beyond the borders of the Anglo-Saxon world. One sign of this impact, among others, is the fact that Anderson has contributed considerably to the dissemination of the concept of, quote, Western Marxism. It should be noted, however, that the French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty had already employed this concept before Anderson's book was published. According to Perry Anderson, Western Marxism originated in the 1920s with Lukács, Korsch, and Gramsci, among others ranged within the current. Alongside these thinkers are the main exponents of the Frankfurt School. A distinctive feature attributed to by Anderson to Western Marxism consists in its structural separation from political praxis. This is its, quote, most fundamental characteristic. Anderson also considers that it is characterized by an obsessive engagement with methodology. According to Anderson, Western Marxism retraced Marx's own development, but in the opposite direction. Marx moved away from philosophy and towards politics and economics, whereas Western Marxism progressively turned back from economics and politics in the terrain of philosophy. The theoretical and his political heterogeneity of the thinker subsumed under the concept of, quote, Western Marxism in Anderson's study presents a problem, however. In general, the meaningfulness of assigning thinkers as heterogeneous as Adorno and Korsch, for example, to one and the same category of Marxism is questionable, even in part on the basis of Anderson's own criteria. This problem cannot be dealt with in more depth here. The term, quote, Western Marxism is used with reservations in the present study because it has become established within this field of research.
Done in here.
All right, there we are. Okay. According to Anderson, the events of May 1968 in Paris altered the conditions for a Marxist-inspired development of theory. The advent of a new period in the workers' movement, bringing to an end the long class pause that divided theory from practice, is now, however, visible. The French Revolt of May 1968 marked in this respect a profound historical turning point. Oh, there's a quote that I missed. Quote, the advent of a new period in the workers' movement, bringing to an end the long class pause that divided theory from practice, is now, however, visible. The French Revolt of May 1968 marked in this respect a profound historical turning point. For the first time in nearly 50 years, a massive revolutionary upsurge occurred within advanced capitalism. Anderson. With this development, Anderson argues, new possibilities are opened up for a new generation of Marxist thinkers. The significance of this is that there is to be a shifting of priorities within the production of theory away from philosophy and towards the political and economic domains. Anderson, who at the time harbored certain sympathies for Trotskyism, particularly emphasizes the role of Trotskyist intellectuals such as Isaac Deutscher or Roman Walsdolsky, to a certain extent exposing them as an alternative to so-called Western Marxism. Anderson writes as follows, quote, Western Marxism was always magnetically polarized towards official communism as the only historical incarnation of the international proletariat as a revolutionary class. It never completely accepted Stalinism, yet it never actively combated Stalinism either. But whatever nuance of attitude successive thinkers adopted towards it, for all of them there was no other effective reality or milieu of socialist action outside it. End quote. Anderson. Which, that really depends on who you're talking about. I think that might be generally true, but I think there's there's important exceptions, namely Korsch. But also, the Frankfurt School were definitely anti-Stalinist. For Anderson, then, it is precisely here that an important difference between Western Marxism and Trotsky is to be found. Although Anderson would have done well to realize that Korsch's political and theoretical opposition to Bolshevism and Stalinism totally contradicts the schema. See? God, I know everything. Anderson's basic conception from 1976 can be represented as follows. So-called Western Marxism should in no way be ignored by a new generation of socialists. It is rather a question of, quote, settling accounts, end quote, with it. A basic condition for the renewal of Marxist thought is, according to Anderson, to learn from this tradition of thought, but also to overcome it. Ultimately, for Anderson, the fact that this tradition, a tradition which is in Anderson's view to be superseded, is geographically bounded, is also a cause of its weakness. Quote, Marxism aspires in principle to be a universal science, no more amenable to merely national or continental ascriptions than any other objective cognition of reality, end quote. Anderson. In his study on so-called Western Marxism, Anderson focuses primarily on thinkers from continental Europe. However, a question which arises is whether non-European thinkers such as Kazuo Fukumoto or Adolfo Sanchez Vasquez might not also be ranged under the category of so-called Western Marxism. If this current were defined according to content-related criteria rather than geographical ones, there would be substantial arguments for locating these theorists in the lineage of so-called Western Marxism. Unfortunately, neither thinkers figure in Anderson's account. Elias Jose Palti writes that, quote, in his survey of Western Marxism, Anderson fails to mention any Latin American current, end quote. Elias Jose Palti. A subsequent book published by Anderson in 1983 titled In the Tracks of Historical Materialism, which is considered later in the course of this study, represents a nadir of theoretical provincialism. Between 1978 and 1982, a 5-volume history of Marxism was published in Italian. This project was characterized by consistently international orientation, both in terms of the authors involved and its relation to its thematic scope. In addition to its focus on the Marxism of Marx's time and the Marxism of the Second and Third Internationals, this project paid close attention to contemporary developments in the area of Marxist theory. Alongside the quote official and quote heretical Marxisms in Eastern Europe, it encompassed not only significant West European currents such as the Della Volpe school and the Althusser school, but also non-European theoretical orientations such as the Japanese Uno school, which is familiar to only a limited number of people outside of Japan at the time. The 5-volume project affords important insights into the globalization of Marx-oriented theory formation up to circa 1980, but a corresponding exposition spanning the last 3 decades remains a desideratum. It is by no means in Europe alone that approaches to the historiography of international Marxism have been developed, as is demonstrated by the comments of Xu Xiaozi, a Chinese researcher of Marxism and a representative of the Institute of Marxism-Leninism Mao Zedong thought at the Chinese Academy of Sciences at the time. Chinese research in the 1980s engaged with Vernitzky and with Western historians of Marxism, among others, and pursued the aim of launching a specifically Chinese historiography of international Marxism. Quote, the proposal for writing and publishing a book titled The History of the Development of Marxism of several volumes by researchers of Marxism in our country, the concerted effort is an important event for Chinese social scientists, end quote. Su Xiaoxi formulates the position to be adopted in such an undertaking as follows, quote, it is understood that to write a history of the development of Marxism, it is necessary to take Marxism-Leninism and Mao Zedong thought as the guide and to adhere to the proletarian stand of the party, end quote. It should be noted, however, that Su Xiaoji himself was the protagonist of an opening up of Chinese Marxism in the post-Mao Zedong era, and that the Institute of Marxism-Leninism Mao Zedong thought was subjected to criticism by dogmatic ideologues and ultimately even state repression in the 1980s. Su Xiaoji can be considered to a certain extent, to represent the opening up of Chinese Marxism vis-a-vis the external world of international Marxism, a process which occurred extremely cautiously at first, and which was not without setbacks. In the mid-1990s, the West German social scientist Michael Kretka engaged with the history of Marxism, distinguishing 4 historical phases. The first of these spans from 1842 to 1883, the year of Marx's death. The second, that of, quote, classical Marxism from 1883 to the First World War. The third phase is characterized by Kretka as follows, quote, it is not so much a phase of, quote, Western Marxism that is inaugurated by the October Revolution and the declaration of the creation of the Soviet Union during the Civil War, but rather a phase of the great schism between, on the one hand, a party and state ideology, Marxism-Leninism, which is very much present in both East and West, and on the other, a variety of Marxism which are more or less loosely associated with the socialist workers' movement outside the Soviet Union, but which no longer play the role of official organization doctrine in these countries. End quote. Kretka. According to Kretka, this historical phase stretches to the end of the 1960s. Kretka then outlines a fourth contemporary period, the phase of a specific social scientific Marxism, with its basis in the Marx Renaissance of the 1960s. Kretka asserts that the Mega 2 edition represents a, quote, constant source of energy, end quote, for this social scientific Marxism. However, it is striking that in his exposition of currents of thought since the 1960s, an exposition undertaken from the standpoint of the history of theory, Kretka refers primarily to Europe and North America, and the development of theory in Asia and Latin America is rather neglected. At the end of the 1990s, the West Berlin political scientist and interpreter of Marx, Michael Heinrich, published an annotated bibliography on the reception and discussion of Marx's critique of political economy. Heinrich's notes contain a thorough historicization of the debate. Heinrich's procedure in this historicization is to separate off a strand of reception oriented to social theory and methodology from the history of the narrowly, quote, economistic debate, and to accord the former rather more attention, especially to its development from 1960 onward. With regard to the readings of Marx which are oriented to social theory and methodology, Heinrich refers to interpretations which, according to him, quote, explicitly do not reduce the critique of political economy to an undertaking within the specialist area of economics, grasping it instead as the analysis and critique of a determinate relation of socialization and of the forms of everyday and scientific consciousness that are generated by the latter, end quote. Heinrich. In his historical literature survey, Heinrich draws mainly on approaches from Western Europe, including the Federal Republic of Germany, Central and Eastern Europe, including the German Democratic Republic, as well as the Anglo-Saxon world. Important Japanese contributions are discussed at the margins of Heinrich's survey. In France, several approaches to the history of Marxism have been developed, covering the period that is the focus of the present study. In the form of a synopsis transcending national and continental boundaries, Jacques Bidet draws a broad arc over the various interpretive currents oriented towards Marx's critique of political economy from the 1960s almost to the present day. He considers the analytic Marxism of the English-speaking countries, the Japanese Uno school, including its, quote, Canadian wing, the West German approaches stemming from the tradition of the Frankfurt School, Alfred Schmidt, Hans-Georg Backhaus, Helmut Reichelt, and the Latin American Marx interpreter influenced by liberation philosophy, Enrique Dussel, but also theoretical currents from Italy, France, and Eastern Europe. However, Bidet lacks the space to provide a thoroughgoing and detailed elaboration of the complexities of the international debate that he touches upon. André Tussel's central focus is a periodization of the history of theory. He divides the development of the debate on Marx and Marxism from the 1960s to 2005 into three stages. The first stage, 1968-1975, is determined by the end of Marxism-Leninism and the last contributions of the great heretics of Marxism. He names Lukács and Bloch as examples. The second period, 1975 to 1989, is characterized by the crisis years of Marxism. The third stage, which begins in 1989, is conceived by Tussel as a period of theoretical pluralism, as a, quote, period of 1,000 Marxisms, end quote. Tussel's overwhelming focus is on France, Italy, Central Europe, especially West Germany, and the Anglo-Saxon world. The historical development of theory in Asia, and in particular in Japan, is excluded, despite the fact that this development is so theoretically rich and of such significance for the history of the formation of theory, drawing on Marx's critique of political economy. However, Tussel does mention Enrique Dussel in relation to the Latin American debate. Contributions to research in the history of Marxism have also been made in Latin America. As far as the history of Latin American Marxism is concerned, the first body of work to cite would be that of the Brazilian Trotskyist and Marx researcher Michael Luvi. A further point of reference in this regard is the work by South American Javier Amadeo. The latter's exposition transcends the boundaries of his own continent. Amadeo traces the historical development of Marxism up to the recent past. He directs his attention especially to French Marxism, Althusserianism among other variants, Italian Marxism, the critical theory of the Frankfurt School, the Budapest School, and Marxism in the Anglo-Saxon world, quote, analytic Marxism, and to the currents. In relation to Marxist thought in Latin America, Amadeo focuses above all on the Marxism of liberation theology, although he is conscious of the fact that while the latter constitutes on his own assessment, quote, one of the most important theoretical currents of our own continent, end quote, it in no way represents the entire bandwidth of Latin American Marxism. Amadeo thus concentrates especially on the historical development traversed by Marxism in the second half of the 20th century in Western and Central Europe, the Anglo-Saxon world, and Latin America. It is a shortcoming of his wide-ranging study that the historical development of Marxism in other countries, i.e. Chinese and Japanese Marxism among others, scarcely comes into the author's field of vision, if at all. An innovative approach to the historicization of the formation of Marxist theory is that undertaken by Ingo Elba and sketched in his essay, quote, Between Marxism and Marxism's Ways of Reading Marxist Theory, end quote, which I believe is on this channel, with a lot of Elba's things on this channel. Elba identifies as core elements of, quote, traditional Marxism, the transformation of Marxian theory into a, quote, closed, proletarian worldview and doctrine of the evolution of nature and history, end quote. Elba. The central significance accorded to ontology, as well as the historicist reconstrual of the form genetic method of Marx's critique of political economy. Elba regards the leading theoretical figures of the Second and Third Internationals as important representatives of, quote, traditional Marxism, such that it becomes evident that this type of Marxism, according to Elba, dominated the theory formed by both the social democratic and communist movements. Elba contends that so-called Western Marxism, which emerged after the First World War and the failure of revolution in the, quote, West, promoted an increased sensibility for the subjective mediatedness of the object and grasped Marxism as a, quote, critical revolutionary theory of social praxis, end quote. Elba's argument is that since the category of praxis and the subjective mediatedness of the object were hardly considered adequately with the paradigm of, quote, traditional Marxism, end quote, Western Marxism should be conceived as an essentially different type of Marxism vis-a-vis the, quote, traditional variant. According to Elba, then, Lukács, Korsch, Gramsci, the Frankfurt School, and the Yugoslav Praxis Group, among others, can be considered important protagonists of Western Marxism. One of the merits of Elba's work is to have devised a systematizing approach in relation to the type of Marxism represented by the new Marx reading, which first began to develop in the 1960s and 1970s, if early precursors are disregarded, such as Isaac Ilyich Rubin and Yevgeny Pashukanis in the Soviet Union of the 1920s. According to Elba, this new Marx reading refers to Marxian theory as a, quote, deciphering and critique of the forms of capitalist socialization, end quote. Elba is concerned to show how the references to the works of Marx and Engels vary according to the respective types of Marxism, and how the latter focus their interest on different text or parts of text from these works as central points of reference. The present study can be held to supplement Elba's pioneering work. A considerable part of the thinkers presented in the present study can be attributed to the new Marx reading, or at least stand in close proximity to it. Moreover, as this study will make clear, this type of theory is not only to be found in West Germany, but represents an international phenomenon. In the meantime, Elba has produced a comprehensive standard work which goes into great depth on the emergence of the development of the new Marx reading in West Germany from the middle of the 1960s, which points the way for future debates on the recent reception of Marx. In this work, Elba refers to the fundamental value theoretical and methodological reflections which have been developed in the recent history of the reception of Marx's critique of political economy, and also to the so-called state derivation debate and to interpretations of Marx's theory of revolution. Although Elba restricts himself in his monograph mainly, but not exclusively, to the West German debate, his work is demonstratively characterized in two respects by an openness to, quote, international perspective, end quote, and by its capacity to establish connections in this regard. Firstly, Elba considers early Soviet thinkers such as Rubin and Pashukanis as precursors of the new Marx reading, and concedes that various later authors from the countries of, quote, actually existing socialism, end quote, stand in a certain proximity to the new Marx reading. Just as a side note, there's another piece that I think I'm going to start reading called, like, Reading Capital in the Two Germanys by... I can't remember her name. But I think, as opposed to Elba and Jan Hoff, I think I have a text by her on this, by this person on the channel, and it's a little bit more anti, to my understanding, is like pretty anti against the new Marx reading. The one essay that I read, at least, was kind of the, basically said that I can't remember exactly, so I'm talking out my ass a little bit here. But basically said that the reason that I can't remember. The reason that the West German theorists, I suppose, people influenced by the Frankfurt School, were so obsessed with were so interested. She might use the word obsessed, I don't know, but so interested in the value form analysis was because of, like, I can't remember. Actually, I'm just talking my ass. Something to the effect, I'll just say something to the effect that they're concerned with the value form theory, and they're concerned with what, like, people in the crisis school, which is not the same thing as the new Marx lecture, new Marx reading, call, like, the esoteric Marx, is because of, like, some type of decline in class struggle and, like, the integration of, like, the working class or something like that, to the point where, like, the focus on exploitation became secondary, or, like, not even concerned or considered, I think was almost her point, which I thought was like kind of like a wild statement. But it might not even be her statement. I'm just riffing here, so take what I say with a grain of salt. Elba also traces the possible influence of Louis Althusser on the West German reception of Marx, and observes that many of the motifs and insights which, quote, would characterize the debate in the Federal Republic of Germany in the 1970s, and quote, are already anticipated in a contribution by the French Marx exponent Jacques Rancière. Secondly, despite his concentration on the new Marx reading in the Federal Republic of Germany, Elba establishes a determination of this special type of theory, which can ultimately be extended to the range of problems with which the international reception of Marx is engaged. In this connection, the criterion, which proves particularly decisive, according to Elba, is that this type of theory is characterized by a perspective on Marxist theory, which is sharply focused specifically on form theory and form critique. Elba consequently locates the international, quote, open Marxism current on the basis of its reference to Rubin, Pashukanis, and form and fetish theory within the new Marx reading. I mean, I think that's definitely true, especially if you consider, well, for one, in English at least, the main way that people became aware of Hans-Georg Bachhaus and Reichel and people like that is because their essays were featured in the original open Marxism volumes from the 90s, edited by, I believe, maybe, I can't remember. It was either edited by both Werner Bonefeld or Werner Bonefeld and John Holloway. It was either one of them. It might have just been Werner Bonefeld and other people, I think, as well. Cosmos Psychopedis and shit like that. People like that. I think the introduction to these works was fundamentally facilitated in the English-speaking world by open Marxism journals, and especially if you consider. I think this is even more the case now. This is published after this book came out, but the book by the magnificent, I think it can't be, for me it was like kind of a game changer in my own thinking, was the publication of the Sage Handbook of Frankfurt School Critical Theory, edited by Werner Bonefeld, Chris O'Kane, and Beverly Best. So I think it's correct to situate open Marxism within this broader world of New Marx reading. Anyway, in this way, Elba's project can form a point of reference for the present study, provided the horizon of the investigation is more rigorously and consistently broadened beyond a West German point of reference. The historian Wolfgang Wippermann has also published an engagement with the history of Marxism. Wippermann's exposition revolves around the thought that Marx led, quote, 4 lives. Accordingly, the first life of Marx was Marx's ode, which is especially determined by his existence as the author of Capital, and through his activity as a political revolutionary, Marx led a kind of, quote, second life in the tradition of the Marxist workers' movement of the Second and Third Internationals. Wippermann grasped the corresponding development in terms of increasing deformation of Marxian theory. According to the German historian, Marx was given a, quote, third lease of life, and, quote, through a renaissance of Marxist thought shaped by, quote, dissident Marxist theories. Wippermann contends that in the most recent past, Marx, having been falsely written off, has once again made a comeback, or been brought back to life. Wippermann argues that Marx deserves to be read once more in the contemporary world, not only as an economist, but also and particularly as a historian and as a philosopher. Wippermann attributes an importance to Marx in relation to the discussion on globalization, concentrates attention on his theories of, quote, Asian despotism and, quote, Bonapartism, and focuses on Marx as a, quote, critic of religion and philosopher, end quote, who can offer an orientation, quote, in the struggle against and overcoming of fundamentalism and in the creation of a better world, end quote. Wippermann. It's very interesting that they use the word fundamentalism here. And if you were curious, if you were curious about this channel, why I have so many things on like anti-Semitism and stuff, it's from engaging with people in the new Marx reading tradition. So I would say people like Moishe Pistone, also to an extent Michal Heinrich, but also obviously Ingo Elba, and all other people who kind of, there's definitely like some kind of like, it's not like a necessary overlap. I don't think like, people also have their different interests, right? They have their different theoretical interests and political priorities and stuff, but there definitely is an overlap to some extent between like anti-German theory and anti-German thought and this new Marx reading. Like a lot of the people who are like most engaged in this, like for instance, like in Germany, a lot of these texts, for instance, like Paschukanis, Roman Rozdalski, Hans-Georg Bachhaus, Helmut Reichelt, I think they published Paschukanis, is published by the Satira, or however you say that name, Satira Verlag. Like, I just think Satira has something to do with like the French Revolution. I can't remember, but that publishing house is like publishes kind of like its main things kind of seem like anti-Deutsche kind of stuff, and also like new Marx reading kind of stuff. Like those seems like they're big things. So that's kind of like, if you were curious about this channel's own kind of like intellectual curiosities, that's where it came from to some extent. And then also an engagement with like third camp Trotskyism, especially in the form it takes in the Workers' Alliance, or excuse me, Alliance for Workers' Liberty in Great Britain. Not that you need to know any of that information, but yeah. Thank you so much for listening.